Welcome and thank you for being here today for this conversation with Professor Brandon Turner on liberalism and illiberalisms. This conversation serves as a capstone for the three lectures that Brandon has given previously over the previous few weeks on the topic of liberalism, as well as some discussions of left-wing and right-wing forms of illiberalism. I hope that everyone has seen those lectures, and if not, I hope that you check them out when they are posted on YouTube. The first one is already available on YouTube to watch, and they are a really interesting set of considerations, and I'm looking forward to getting into them with Brandon today. So let me first introduce myself a little bit. I'm Bradley Jackson. I'm a senior program officer at the Institute for Humane Studies, where I work on a lot of our programs related to the current state of liberalism and illiberalism. I am a political theorist by training. My own work is in folks like Thomas Hobbes and Adam Smith and others in the early modern liberal tradition. And I, in addition to my work at IHS, teach political theory at American University. I'm very excited to have this conversation with Brandon Turner today. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Clemson University. He has published work on thinkers such as Mill, Ferguson, Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Mandeville, which is an impressive array of thinkers for any theorist to be publishing on simultaneously. A lot of people just pick one and stick with it, but Brandon likes to write widely, and that's wonderful. So I expect to have a wide-ranging conversation today on some of the themes of the lectures that Brandon has recently given. So again, thank you all for being here. There will be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience later in the program. And so if you have questions or when you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat box down at the bottom, and we will get to those a bit later. So Brandon, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Brad, for serving as an interlocutor in this instance, and thanks again to the Institute for Humane Studies for having me on for this series. And thanks to all in attendance currently, or in attendance virtually sometime in the future. Thanks for taking the time to talk ideas.
I will do my best to be a Hippias to your Socrates. So let's begin with the current state of liberalism, sort of as an idea and as a political practice. We're recording this on Veterans Day, Armistice Day, November 11th of 2020, in an interesting time in American history and interesting time for liberalism. And I just wanted to begin by giving you the opportunity to reflect on what liberalism means this week in America.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're only a week out. I guess we're a week and a day out from Election Day, and we actually seem less certain of where we are now than we were a week ago. So it would seem foolish, actually, for me to say anything definitive or anything profound, I think, about the election. And in particular, I want to, completely and totally ignore any immediate reactions we have in terms of demographic shifts towards one party or the other, or anything like that. The exit polls seem to me, particularly this year, when so much voting was conducted beforehand, they seem totally worthless. And I would caution everyone against reading anything at all into the exit polls or anything into the kind of instant reactions that we have to the election. I would have two things that I've reflected on. So on the one hand, 5-10 years ago, I was not a strong believer, but a believer in what we might think of as a kind of public choice understanding of institutions, which just meant that, listen, from a public choice perspective, and of course, there are varying degrees of public choiceness. I think public choice probably terminates in something like complete and total cynicism about human motivation. Probably 5 or 10 years ago, I was on board with the general view that you cannot rely on people to do the right thing. That, to put it in, I guess, more classical terms, we cannot rely on virtue when it comes to politics, when it comes to political action, and that we are much better off if we rely not on virtuous actors, but rather on institutions. And in particular, if we rely on institutions that are designed for, what modern thinkers would call knaves. So just assume that the very worst people are going to make it into politics. Assume that the very worst people are going to be successful in politics. So politics is a kind of selection machine for the very worst people we have. And of course, we have, I think, there is evidence that this might be the case. And so just design institutions accordingly, right? Design institutions in such a way that the very worst people will be motivated, even perhaps by their most irredeemable passions, by their ambition, by their lust for power, will be nonetheless be motivated to act in ways that are conducive to the public good. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I thought that could be done. I'm far less certain of that now than I was before. The fact is that institutions are not machines. They are not perpetual motion machines. They do not maintain themselves. That institutions can be subverted. That those participating in the institutions, i.e. members of Congress who have been there for 20, 30 years, know the weak points of our institutional designs far better than we do. That practice will, in some sense, always outstrip design. Practice will always outstrip our best laid plans, as it were. And so we're always rushing to get caught up. So even if we think that the institutional view is the realist view, it's just not. Because our conceptions, our knowledge about institutions, our theories about institutions, they're always, the owl that takes flight only after the action has taken place. I think at some point, liberals and libertarians maybe need to pay a little bit more attention, actually, to virtue as it pertains to motivations. And in particular, might want to attend to the idea that maybe we really should expect people who participate in politics to have some conception of the common good, and to be willing to, at various times, set aside their own private gain to the pursuit of that. And I think that, anyway, that's a thought that I've had. The second thought that I've had is on the question of legitimacy. Right now we're in the midst of what seems like a crisis of legitimacy. Maybe not. Maybe in 2 weeks it'll look ridiculous to call this a crisis of legitimacy. There are plenty of people who seem to reject entirely any kind of public worrying about legitimacy. But legitimacy is a funny thing. And again, within the liberal tradition, I think we have two ways of thinking about legitimacy, two ways that aren't particularly, I think, compatible with one another. So we have legitimacy as a kind of moral, as a moral term, as a term that exists within a moral vocabulary about authority. So this is legitimacy that emphasizes consent, that emphasizes contract, right? The only legitimate government, the only legitimate use of political power is that which either is agreed upon or could be agreed upon by a rational person. That tells us nothing about what we're doing right now, about what we're seeing right now. The second form of legitimacy is the kind that we find in somebody like Hume, somebody like Burke, for whom legitimacy is, a fairly squirrely thing. Legitimacy, Hume would tell us, exists in the minds, in the opinions of the governed. Right? How do you know a regime is legitimate? Well, just ask people. Does it seem legitimate? Do they consider it legitimate? It doesn't exist anywhere outside of that. It's merely a function of how people can think about the regimes under which they're living. And I think right now we're looking at a situation in which it would seem that people no longer think the regime is legitimate, or no longer think the way we have, the means that we have for deciding who ought to occupy the regime are legitimate. I think that's probably a real problem. And the funny thing about legitimacy is that, again, it is somewhat squirrely. It's there until it's no longer there. And we know a lot more about what leads, or we have much stronger intuition about what leads to a crisis of legitimacy than we do about how we might build legitimacy, or how a concept of legitimacy that's conducive to public order, how that kind of thing is pieced together. There does seem to be an effort to, in some sense, consume whatever public trust is left, to consume it and convert it basically into private political gain. And I would strongly discourage that.
That's very interesting. It reminds one of the old saying about bankruptcy, right? How do you go bankrupt? Little by little, and then all at once. And likely something like that may be true of political legitimacy as well. So your framing of that was fascinating. I think especially in light of some of the things that you discussed in your first lecture out of this series, where you distinguished sort of 4 different ways of looking at liberalism. State authority, which I think is a question of legitimacy, and then the office of government, these kind of institutional questions. Your third sort was just the way that we describe our contemporary politics. And then your fourth sort was associational. And throughout your lectures, you made clear that you were kind of privileging the institutional and associational views as being the most helpful for describing kind of average everyday politics, whereas the kind of Lockean Jeffersonian questions of state authority, are more bound up in kind of constitution-making questions about how we envision legitimacy in the first place. And so let me just say that it's a little bit concerning to hear that now Locke and Jefferson are becoming more potentially topical. However, this also reminds me of a distinction that Harvey Mansfield makes in a great essay he wrote on 1688 years ago, where he talks about the difference between great politics and small politics, and how great politics takes place at the regime level, small politics takes place more or less at the policy level. And to move then from that great politics level of regime questions and legitimacy to move more toward the kind of small politics that we're better off sticking with if we want to live in a stable regime. I'm interested to drill down on one of the discussions you had in that first lecture about the claim that we are all, in some sense, already liberals to the extent that we find ourselves within a liberal regime, living in a kind of a liberal age. And most people who kind of are part of the American mainstream are some sort of liberal, right? And you further discuss how, as intellectual agents living in a world that is changing and ever new, it's up to us to decide what liberalism means today, right? And so I would like to talk a little bit more about that with you and ask, how should we sort of, with the tradition as our sort of storehouse of ideas, how should we try to formulate for ourselves a liberal politics that is principled and yet timely, and not hidebound to the past and to believing that all the answers are literally in John Locke or ideas like this?
I mean, it's a great question. And I mean, I think, so part of what I was trying to get at in that discussion was to maybe move us in new directions in terms of our, I mean, it's not just a question of method. At some level, questions of method always come back to questions of like, what is the nature of our inquiry? I think there's a tendency in academic circles, I think there's a tendency, particularly in libertarian academic circles, there's a tendency to describe what we're doing as, in some sense, an act of discovery, an act of excavation. There's this tendency that if we can demonstrably prove some historical fact or some piece of a text, if we can prove that our interpretation is the correct one, that something then becomes unlocked in our rhetoric today or in our arguments today or something like that, that we can in effect conduct ourselves politically through our academic work. And part of what I wanted to do in that talk was, on the one hand, just to be explicit about the fact that that is what's happening. I think we can do that better, i.e. we can deploy a liberal tradition in the pursuit of a liberal conception of politics. I think we can do it better if we're honest about what it is that we're doing, if we're upfront and explicit about this. But I think there's a broader point that isn't just to liberals or isn't just to libertarians about the nature of inquiry. We are always inquiring in some way and to some end. And so just for example, I mean, intellectual history is a pretty good example. Intellectual history, right? Is it history? I mean, it's kind of history in the sense that it's concerned with, you know, what somebody might, like Oakeshott, might call the historical mode, right? We're trying to describe events in some sense, but the events themselves are ideas. And so in intellectual history, it seems clear to me that there's never going to be a purely historical kind of intellectual history, in the sense that all ideas require, at some level, interpretation. I mean, all ideas require many of the ideas that we deal with require translation. Everything requires interpretation. Everything requires us, in other words. And I just kind of want people to start thinking about that. Now, when it comes to how we do liberal politics and how we incorporate intellectual history into liberal politics, I think the storehouse metaphor is a pretty good one. And I think that's, I don't know if that was yours or if I said something like that, but I mean, I think that's basically correct, right? So we want to understand how to conduct ourselves in a way that's consistent with a set of principles that we hold. We know that there has been 200, 300, 400 years of very smart people reacting to contexts which have a certain pattern to them that we can identify today, right? Contexts that are different but not alien to ours. And this is just a wealth of ideas that we have available to us. These are conversations that we can have and that we can benefit from and that we can then pull into our contemporary politics. So I'm not saying abandon intellectual history. I'm not saying abandon the tradition in whatever sense we conceive it. I'm just saying that we need to recognize that these endeavors, that the endeavor that something like IHS is interested in, in funding and seeing more of, that this is always going to be conditioned by our present needs. We need a theory that's going to help us. We need ideas that are going to help us think about politics today. And at some level, I think we can put concerns about, you know, fidelity to a tradition. We can put concerns about properly labeling this person a liberal or not a liberal. We can really just sort of put these to the side.
It's very interesting. So to think more about what it would mean to put some of those ideas into action and to think about how to live practically in our own time, I think that your second lecture, which is on left-wing varieties of illiberalism, has a lot of food for thought in that regard. So in particular, you talk in that lecture about how in the history of liberalism, we see a steady undercurrent of liberation politics, right? The kind of liberatory potential that holds, not only, should I be free to do as I choose, but others should be free as well. And to the extent that others aren't, that's a problem, right? And we therefore, want to lift others up to the to have some sort of a potential to live full human lives. And this makes sense of the fact that so many kind of civil rights movements, kind of feminism, abolitionism, et cetera, were sort of born within a liberal matrix. However, also in this lecture, you talk about how in Rousseau and in Marx in particular, this desire for liberation kind of runs rampant and becomes, rather than liberation from external despotism or unfreedom, becomes liberation from an internal kind of unfreedom or alienation, which requires a radical revisioning of society, requires people forcing people to be free, to use Rousseau's phrase, and ends up in kind of an illiberal place. So the thing I'd like to ask about is, we are today confronted with the responsibility, according to this kind of tradition of liberal politics, of asking whether there are those in the world who, for moral reasons, need to be liberated from oppression. And we can see evidence in our own country, let alone abroad, that there are many populations who are being oppressed in various ways by the state, by other methods. And we simultaneously see this kind of in so-called woke politics and in the most radical reaches of the American left wing, we see this Rousseauan romantic desire to liberate us from ourselves, to rid us of biases we might not even know we have, that have been given to us by a system that is so rotten that it must be destroyed, and you need to be forced to have a more free and liberated ideology. So we see both of these tendencies, the felt need on the one hand to liberate people from oppression, and the present danger, on the other hand, of avoiding the illiberal tendency to force people to be free. And so how should we, as liberal actors, try to apply principle to solving some of those really vexed questions that face us today?
I mean, I'm not so sure that principles are gonna help us. I mean, principles can guide us, but ultimately, it's a matter of judgment. So there are a few moving parts here that have to be kind of disentangled. On the one hand, so when we talk about systemic racism, we often confuse a couple things. We confuse, for example, systemic and systematic racism. We confuse systemic and widespread racism. And it's actually, I think it's extremely important to keep these things straight. So for example, if it turns out that, for example, we have a police force, and you read about these in the news, a police force who's in a Facebook group, and it turns out that this entire, county sheriff's office or whatever is just rife with abhorrently racist attitudes. Right, that's a problem, right? That's a problem with actual racism. So in other words, we have reason to think that these people hold racist views that will materially impact their ability to enforce the law. So that's concerning. We also have something like white flight. So, the resegregation of America's schools. So what is the nature of the problem when it comes to resegregation of America's schools? Well, it seems like what happened was a bunch of people with money decided that they wanted their kids to go to better schools. They decided they wanted their kids to have more opportunities. They decided that they wanted their kids to be as safe as they could possibly be, right? Or at least safer in the way that they perceived them to be safe. And so they moved out of the cities and they settled in the suburbs, and they effectively resegregated society in that way. Now, the funny thing is that libertarians and people familiar, in other words, people familiar with the tradition of spontaneous order, thinking about the way that order can emerge, the way that patterns and order can be the product of human action, but not human design. We have plenty of tools to understand what's going on here, right? So this is an outcome that has real and material effects on people according to their race, that nonetheless is not the product, seemingly not the product of racism, right? So maybe some of these people moved out of the cities because they didn't like Black people. But I think most people, at least the story they told themselves, was that they were moving out because they wanted better opportunities for their kids, which is, I mean, frankly, it's an unimpeachable motivation for moving. You can't fault someone for wanting the best circumstances for their own children. So those are two situations in which I think we have plenty of reason to be worried and plenty of reason to act politically. We should be concerned with processes which, even though not motivated by explicit racism, nonetheless produce outcomes that clearly have disparate impacts in terms of race. I think we have plenty of reasons to worry about that, and I think we have plenty of reasons to think that should private associations be unable to deal with this kind of problem, then political associations are, I mean, the state, right, the government solutions ought to be available. And I think that goes for liberals and libertarians, actually. When it comes to the former case where we have officials acting in ways, in other words, officials leveraging the power of the state in ways that appear to be motivated by genuine racial animus, that's also a huge problem, and that needs to be addressed. And again, it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed not from the perspective of legitimacy, but from the perspective of liberal association, right? Liberal association depends on norms of civility and civil society that depend on us all being free and equal participants in the order. And these things are disastrous in every imaginable way to these things. We can't be free and equal if we have enormous material divides between the races. We can't have a free and equal society if we have the power of the state being used from racially motivated animus. So those, I think, are real concerns. And I mean, I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that those are real concerns. But those are the grounds on which we ought to be concerned about these sorts of things. Where we run into problems is when we delve deeper. So in other words, if we say something like, you know, the real reason why these people fled to the suburbs is because deep down they're scared of Black people. Now, whether or not that's true, and I want to completely and totally bracket the fact that that's true, the idea that we then have as a kind of a public project, right? Something to which we're going to contribute state resources and possibly state power. We're going to try to address kind of deep racial fears, right? The racial fears that aren't explicit, that people may not even be willing to acknowledge to themselves, but deep down we think that they're in there. That is concerning, right? That is where I think we can begin to draw lines and say, this is too much. This is, on the one hand, this is too much to expect the state to do. And secondly, at some point, this simply violates our commitment to something like the individual as the inviolable moral center of a liberal society. So to the extent that wokeness proposes to use civil or state power to get at these deep-seated fears, to get at unconscious bias, to get at these sorts of things, I think we have really good reasons to be very, very skeptical of that kind of thing. So that's a third moving part. Then there's one final moving part, which is wokeness as a kind of cultural project. So for example, if the Academy Awards want to put into place rules that stipulate how many, like basically racial quotas in terms of every year for Best Actor, we're going to have one actor of color, or et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of anti-wokeness discourse tends to conflate these things, on the one hand, a new constitutional body in charge of rooting out racial animus among the civil service, tends to confuse that with the Academy Awards trying to be more inclusive, confuses that with the discourse around representation and culture and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot in that discourse, this non-political discourse, this what we might think of as cultural discourse. There's a lot to object to, but it's not stuff that I think we should object to for liberal reasons. I think there are other reasons for which we can object to this. I think, in other words, we might articulate cultural or aesthetic reasons for objecting to racial quotas in Academy Awards, but I don't think we can articulate a political reason for this or a liberal reason. And I think we need to keep our reasons separate. And I think we ought to recognize that a lot of this cultural discourse is good, or it's necessary, it's needed, that we can affect certain kinds of change on these sorts of fronts through culture, through the evolution of norms, rather than through the heavy hand of the state. And to the extent that we can do that, we ought to encourage that.
So just a follow up on one of those points, just to potentially clarify it, particularly thinking about this, the white flight example, and how the disparate outcomes kind of prompt one to consider what kind of ameliorative action could be taken, short of delving into the right of conscience, as you kind of suggested. But I got the impression there, and this is what I'd like to ask about, that there may have been a suggestion that, for example, property rights are like more malleable, fungible, what have you, with respect to addressing some of these problems than rights of conscience might be. And I'm wondering if you have a theory in which some of these individual rights are kind of hierarchically based, and if you could just say a little bit more about that, because it struck me as interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, so I think, so I actually, I mean, I think property rights are pretty high up there, but I think it depends on what we mean by property rights. So for example, I do not think that taxation violates property rights in the same way that, seizure or eminent domain or anything like that does. In other words, I think far too much focus is placed on taxation and its relationship to property rights than, especially in libertarian discourse, I think. Now, obviously, there are levels of taxation which are basically confiscation, which are basically seizure. But for the most part, I think normally when we're talking about tax rates, when we're talking about the tax cuts we got from the Trump administration, when we talk about potential tax raises under the Biden administration, this discourse simply does not raise to the level of a property rights discourse. It's just, we're talking about two different things. And I realize that that is a somewhat unpopular view, probably with many of the people watching. So I do think there's a hierarchy of rights. I do think that rights of conscience are higher than most of what we think of as individual rights. I certainly think the rights of conscience are higher than normally the rights at play when we talk about taxation. Yeah, I do think that's the case. Now, does that mean that we can? So it's a question like forced busing, school busing, I think really gets at the heart of this issue, because it's just so difficult to entangle. And without actually saying what I think about busing, partly because I don't, we're some time removed from this. I don't have any firsthand experience with busing. I don't know the historical account of busing that well. I think this is a pretty good example of essentially the limits of what we think of as the liberal tradition. I just don't think that excavating another, treatise of natural jurisprudence from the 18th century and sticking to that or something like that is really going to help us sort through this. I mean, we need to be able to think rather than merely apply, or sorry, apply is the wrong word, because apply is actually what I think we need to do, rather than merely kind of translate or copy principles from the past into today. I mean, we need to have these things at hand. We need to recognize that there are always going to be trade-offs, but that having, forms of association that systematically privilege one race over another, I mean, that's a problem. And it's a problem no matter how thin our politics are, how thin our conception of liberal association is. Liberal association, again, it depends on free and equal participation in civil society. And to the extent that threats to that are brought about by processes that no one intends, I don't think that libertarians ought to then suddenly wipe their hands of them. If anything, we have the tools, we're sort of uniquely situated to have the tools to understand how these outcomes come about. We're uniquely situated to see how something like serious racial disparity might be the product of human action, but not human design.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to turn now to ask a question about your third lecture in the series, which was about right-wing illiberalism, and contained a really fascinating discussion about conservatism, its meaning within a liberal context, and how there is a way in which conservatism within the American framework is deeply liberal because it seeks to kind of conserve a sort of liberal politics. And you compare conservatism with what you call reaction, and describe how reaction is a fundamentally unconservative point of view that wishes to completely revolutionize society in the name of, generally speaking, going back to some quasi-mythical time when things were better. And we, whatever the we is constituted as, felt more at home. And you describe how a lot of the kind of driving force behind this sort of reactionary populism or the other kind of forms of reactionary politics in America today, a lot of that is driven by a kind of a cultural malaise, a feeling that people have that they're not at home here anymore, and they want to break this kind of decadent, depraved culture and kind of replace it with something more whole. So the question that sort of comes out of that is, how can we make political moves to kind of heal this rupture in our culture without giving too much to the forces of reaction, right? Because clearly something must be done to make people feel more at home in this culture if we're going to have a stable, thriving, unified political culture to the extent that people are at least agree on basic principles, right? So how do we create that feeling of homeliness, being at home for folks without giving in to the radical proposals that they have? And I think that there is a similar question for the kind of Marxist left, who feel alienated from the culture, believe that the only way they could ever feel at home in this culture is if it was destroyed and built again from the bottom up. And so I think we have two groups in the society who are strong and loud and important because they are our fellow citizens, who are telling us they don't feel at home here and these things need to change. We have, I think, a reasonable desire to want more people to feel at home here. And yet the things they want changed are often diametrically opposed. And so it feels as though liberals who want to bring more people into this system are in a real bind. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I do have a few thoughts on that. One is that it's funny. Normally, when we think about the discourse of alienation, we normally associate it with the left. Particularly somebody like Marx, right? The idea of a radical reconfiguring of society, we associate it more with left-wing, sort of bottom-up revolutionary movements, the kind of movements that characterized, the 19th and early 20th centuries. But I think you're much more likely to hear these sort of appeals today on the right. And so I think there are a few things to think about here. On the one hand, I think this is actually where a lot of more traditionally conservative policy work actually is pretty useful. So I don't know this literature well enough to have sort of like definitive views in terms of who is right and who we ought to look more at. But I will say that you're much more likely to have heard concerns over the past 15, 20 years from the National Review crowd when it comes to something like the disintegration of the family, out of wedlock births, failures in the American education system that don't just have to do with inequality, but failures in terms of what's being taught and how it's being taught. These sorts of complaints, I think you're much more likely to hear from more conservative voices. And that's essentially what they've been on about for 20 to 25 years. I mean, my adult life anyway, most conservative policy wonks were concerned with the family as the site where alienation was ameliorated, family as the antidote to feelings of alienation. And I mean, I think there is something to that. I think a lot of the kind of the rising rhetoric surrounding alienation that we hear on both sides, I think, this is more of an intuition than it is a kind of settled empirical view that I have. And if challenged on this, I probably wouldn't be able to push back very hard. But I think we do have a situation where the family is changing, where people are waiting far longer, especially educated people are waiting far longer to get married. and a lot longer to have children, if they have children at all. So families are smaller, they form later, they're more likely to end. And this is the different crowd. I think the kind of the educated tale of the distribution of education and class and all this kind of stuff. They're more likely to put off marriage, but once they get into marriage, they have more stable but smaller families. Whereas on the other end, you have bigger families, but they're far more likely to have absent parents and turmoil and domestic violence and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's something to be said for that. That might be a place to look, in other words, to get at the sources of alienation. On the other hand, I think one of the artifacts of our current, the way that we talk about politics, the way that we morally conceptualize politics, we don't really like to talk about elites, and we don't really like to talk about the way that elites affect their constituencies. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years is a real shift in how the right talks about alienation, and in particular how right-leaning intellectuals and kind of pseudo-intellectuals talk about alienation. I think 20, 25 years ago, you were likely to hear that alienation was a problem, that it had to be addressed through various policy initiatives. Today, if you turn on Fox News, I mean, Tucker Carlson in particular is really good at this. I mean, if it's possible to stoke alienation, Tucker Carlson does a really good job of it, right? I mean, that bonkers session he had the other day after the election about how Kamala Harris will make sure that everybody is drinking Starbucks. The word he used was forever. It'll be all Starbucks all the time, forever. I mean, it's bizarre actually how completely effortless Carlson and others have been able to completely co-opt this language that you would have heard almost exclusively on the left, and maybe on some like rural theorists, 30, 40 years ago, and just completely move it to a new context. And if there's one thing that right elites seem almost committed to now, it's in not just identifying, but propagating alienation as a condition of right-wing politics. Vote like you want your country back. Vote, like you want these elites to know that you're not going to take it anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. I think, in other words, I think right-leaning intellectuals and quasi-intellectuals and whatever thought leaders have been unbelievably irresponsible in how they prime their constituencies for feelings of alienation. In fact, I mean, again, somebody like Carlson is very good at this. I mean, what he is very good at is showing images of debauchery, of, what he thinks of as American corruption or something like that, and saying, this is what your country has become. We have to reject this entirely. And of course, I mean, you just go up and down the line. And when it comes to, intellectuals who think that America needs a complete and total reset, whether it be the Claremont crowd and the Flight 93 crowd on the one hand, or whether it be the integralists, or whether it be the kind of religious withdrawal advocated by somebody like Rod Dreher. I mean, you're more likely to find this view that the world is irredeemable and it can only be burnt to the ground. I mean, I think you're more likely to find that not just on the right, but among right elites. And there's a sense in which, well, we normally think about, traditionally we thought that left elites kind of outpaced their more moderate constituents, and right elites in some sense pulled their more radical constituents to the center. Right? This was, of course, the traditional role of the Beltway, National Review, the cocktail party set, was that they knew that moderate policies were the best, and they had to kind of pull their backwards constituency along with them. Now we see, I think on the other hand, I think the right elites are way out ahead of their constituencies, and they're actually stoking a lot of these reactionary fears.
Okay, let's go now to questions from the audience. So just a reminder, if you have a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can type your question in there, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So we'll start with this one. what would be the underlying nature of liberty in the liberal discourse? Is it understood in relation to oppression only? What about the distinction between negative and positive liberty? Do we need to formulate various concepts of liberty stemming from different traditions and cultures? I would appreciate you kindly to talk about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, so anti-oppression or liberation is one theme within the liberal tradition, but it isn't the whole thing, right? There are many different, the longer you spend in this, studying this, the more liberalisms you come across. So, for example, there's the liberalism of somebody like Judith Shklar, who describes a liberalism of fear that puts cruelty first, something that she draws from Montaigne and Montesquieu and several others. There's the liberatory liberalism of Locke and John Brown. I mean, this is clearly not a liberalism that puts cruelty first, right? This is a liberalism that thinks that a certain amount of cruelty may be necessary. You don't say something like, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of tyrants from time to time if you're putting cruelty first. So there are many different liberalisms that highlight or that recenter different values within the liberal tradition that may often be in tension with one another. I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but there were a couple questions tucked in there. Maybe if that person wants to ask again, feel free to ask again.
One thing that we could maybe get a little bit more into is, do we need to formulate various concepts of liberty that stem from different traditions and cultures?
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, so in that case, yeah, I would say that especially my comments on not messing with people's underlying prejudices and underlying the kind of the inner citadel of the mind, the unconscious or whatever. That does strike me as totally consistent with Berlin's distinction between positive and negative liberty. That distinction seems to exist nowadays, especially in academia, only as a kind of right. It exists because we need something to dump on. We need something to contrast our own new conception of liberty with. But I actually think it's a perfectly useful distinction that doesn't really that definitely hasn't gone away. However, there are plenty of other distinctions. So liberty of contract, just economic liberty in general, right? Property rights, liberties of conscience, religious liberties. All these sorts of things, they're all there. It really is a big mess, right? That we have to kind of pick through. We have to find what appears to be useful. And we need to think about doing intellectual history as precisely that, digging through this big mess of values, this big mess of concepts that don't always fit together. All right, we are basically trying to, rig some form of political action, and we're just dealing with the tools that we have available to us, with the pieces and parts that are laying about. So we got to find them, dust them off, figure out what they look like, and possibly fit them into our project. And if not, put them back.
This next question is a question with regard to how to respond effectively to left-wing illiberalism. The question is this: how can wokeness be countered effectively, short of real, concrete counterbalancing exercises of power, however messy? For example, Bonkers Tucker with his alienation stoking. To push back against the whole pervasive drift of the massive administrative state, increasingly micromanaging our lives and poisoning our social spaces, including academia, the workplace, social media, and so forth, with ubiquitous, tyrannical, illiberal enforcement of progressive ideology at the expense of individual autonomy. Or he asks, is it not okay to fight back for the sake of our natural, God-given, constitutionally guaranteed rights as citizens?
So there's a lot going on in that question. I would say this: depends on what wokeness we're talking about. So if we're talking about the Academy Awards, then no, I don't think it's permissible to push back with systems of government at all. If it's something else, so for example, just something pulled from the news. So there was the 1619 Project, which the New York Times ran, which was was momentous last year. Everyone read this. There was a lot of discourse around it. That was great. When I say that was great, it was great to have the project. It was great to have public discourse. The problem that we ran into was that it almost immediately, the 1619 project was tailored for, right, was edited and tailored for state-run education programs. That I think is more problematic. And in fact, that was done seemingly, I mean, it was just sort of announced, right? We've put this together as a high school curriculum, and you have to wonder, like, on what grounds was this adopted? What are the what oversight is there to determine whether or not the 1619 project is going to be taught in schools? So I think a perfectly rational response to the 1619 project is to dispute it publicly if you have problems with it, to discuss it, to talk about it. I mean, the New York Times is not a government agency. Don't read the Times if you don't want to read about the 1619 project. That's reasonable. Once you hear that the 1619 project is now part of your high school curriculum, then yeah, I think questions should be raised, particularly if we think of public education as being the site of contestation. Absolutely, raise all sorts of issues about whether or not the 1619 project is being taught as a historical text in your high school. The way we don't want to respond is precisely how the anti-wokeness crowd responded, which was the commissioning of some, congressional or executive body on American education, and then Trump essentially promising a new, I forget what he called it, but something like patriotic education. That's a cure that is at least as bad as the disease, if not worse. So again, I think when it comes to wokeness, great pains must be taken to distinguish between private or associational pursuits of wokeness and public pursuits of wokeness. One of them is permissible. One of them is not only permissible, but is, good to the extent that it can be engaged with, to the extent that good faith discussions can be had about it. And the other one is bad. And I think we should respond to each accordingly.
Thank you. Next question. I struggle with many of the empirical applications of liberalism. For example, the notion of virtue in liberalism, when virtue is expected from individuals, specifically entrepreneurs, but denied for politicians, especially at a time like today when many heads of state in North and South America have come from the entrepreneurial world. At what point do liberals decide that they've become enough of a politician to be able to lose their virtue?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I mean, there is, and I think there is a sense in which a lot of what public choice does is it, in conceiving of politics without romance, right? It treats politicians essentially as economic actors. So in other words, we're going to model politician behavior in the same way that we would model someone participating. So as an entrepreneur, for example, someone pursuing their own self-interest through the pursuit of business. I mean, it's funny, to the extent that I would expect business people to be virtuous. In other words, I would expect them to honor their contracts. I would expect them not to, tie up each and every one of their contractors with litigation, stiff people, and all this kind of stuff. I don't think it's too much to ask politicians or officials to be virtuous. So when it comes to empirical application, I mean, there's a lot to be said here. I mean, I think as liberals, we simply need to expect more, I think. We need to expect more out of government officials. I think our attitude in the past has been, right, we expect them to be as awful as they can be, and that institutions or other officials will catch them or, constrain them in some way. And I'm far less certain that that's the case now. And I mean, so as we've seen with something like the Hatch Act, for example, or something like, a really good example is the tendency in the Trump administration to appoint cabinet members or to appoint heads of various agencies that need to be confirmed by the Senate. That's directly written into, that's the advice and consent powers of Congress. They're being directly and deliberately circumvented right out in the open. This isn't like secret. We all know that this is happening. Half of these agencies have acting heads as a way of getting around congressional oversight. I mean, there's no one there to enforce that. Nobody cares. it would seem that the very minimum is that we would expect people to abide by constitutional limitations, and it seems like we can no longer expect that.
Thank you. So last question. Given the current status of the Republican Party and the sort of political coalitions that formed around the recent election, I'm just wondering, sort of as a political scientist, do you believe that we're currently seeing a secular realignment of the political parties? And if so, where do you think that conservatism, in the way that you've described it in your lecture series, where do you think that that fits into the kind of realignment that we may be seeing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, so I think that there is something to the realignment thesis. In particular, another friend of IHS, Steve Davies, where Steve's at what, I forget what it, IEA. Do you know where Steve is? He's on Facebook is where he is in my world. I mean, so Steve Davies, he's a British historian slash economist slash jack of all trades. And Steve has for years been talking about a kind of a global realignment of Western politics in general into what he thinks of as just an open party and a closed one, or a party of open society and one of closed societies. I think that there is something to that. And in fact, actually, if I had a read on the 2020 election, it would be that. It clearly was not the great rebuke to Trumpism that we expected. And not only that, but if it is the case that the Republicans really did see serious gains among, for example, Hispanics, I think we can really and truly expect a new realignment in politics in which one party is comparatively open to what we think of as the processes of globalization. So is more cosmopolitan in terms of their interests, in terms of their aesthetic interests, in terms of their work, right? So they're more likely to be doing sort of intellectual work, doing work that isn't bound to one particular location. These people they're going to tend to be more open to immigrant populations, more open to new experiences, more open to travel, more open to international coalitions and all this kind of stuff. And then on the other side, a party that emphasizes locality, that is interested in closing localities to outsiders, that it's interested in enforcing certain standards of norms and conduct and all this kind of stuff. I think there might really and truly be something to that. So where is conservatism in that? I think that actually the conservatism that I described in the third lecture can fit into a party that has as its orientation the open society. I think particularly the conservatism that focuses on the fragility and almost mystifyingly complex nature of order, I think can fit very nicely into a party that emphasizes an open society. I think there's a conservatism that emphasizes tolerance and methods of living together in a society. In other words, a conservatism that's premised on civility as the condition of living together, I think fits better with the party of the open society than it does in the latter.
Steve Davies is at the Institute for Economic Affairs,
IEA, yeah. So and he's got a couple essays on this that he's published in various places. Or if you just go to his Facebook feed, he's got a lot of long posts where he discusses these things. So yeah, that would be of interest to anyone interested in these kind of major realignments currently going on.